Bird, and I'm the Fan Liaison Officer at Level Playing Field. And hello to the Level Playing Field ambassadors, Stephen and Morgan Parry, as well as Stephen Miller, who are on this call. We are having this chat today because on the 1st of October 2020, it will be the 10-year anniversary of the Equality Act. I think this video is going out a couple of days after. The Act was introduced to protect people against discrimination, harassment, or victimization in employment, as well as the use of public and private services based on 9 protected characteristics. One of those characteristics is disability. So the Equality Act is at the forefront of the work that we do at Level Playing Field and has supported us when we look to work with clubs to bring about equality and access and inclusion at live sporting fixtures. But obviously it's had an impact on people's individual lives, and that's why I'm going to talk to the Stephens and the Morgan today about the Equality Act. So Stephen Miller, I'll come to you first, pal. How has the Equality Act impacted you over the years?
Yeah, I think it's been very important for all people who are discriminated against in these protected groups. I can't believe it's 10 years old, actually. It doesn't seem like that long since the Equality Act came in. But yeah, I think it has made a big difference in society, and just kind of the most important thing is make people aware that this exists and that people are discriminated against on a daily basis, and just bringing it more into focus and making people think about what they can do to make their facilities, their venues more accessible for people with disabilities. In my case, that's what's really important to me. I think, yeah, we have seen a big improvement in accessibility in businesses thinking about how they can make their services accessible to everyone. And yeah, I think for me, I see a big difference in transport. I mean, I get public transport quite a lot, and years ago, you'd had to wait. I could wait over an hour to get a bus with a ramp, and sometimes you'd be waiting, and there'd be 3 or 4 buses go past, and they go, I haven't got a ramp, I can't get on the bus. And yeah, that was really frustrating when you're trying to get to work, or you're trying to go into town and meet friends, and you don't know what time you're going to get there because you don't know if you can get on the bus or not. So I think, yeah, things like that have made a big difference.
Stephen and Morgan, how about yourselves? How has it impacted both of your lives?
Yeah, well, I think if I think back 2010, so 10 years ago, so Morgan would be 13. He's just had his birthday. So over that period, I think, as Stephen said, it's influenced how facilities have changed. So that's one thing, buildings, venues. But I think it's also made an impact on like the systems that like public bodies or private bodies have. And also, I think the third element is the impact it's had on staff and staff awareness and training in venues. So on facilities, so if I think back 10 years, say specifically about football, there's just more accessible spaces in football grounds, not just for wheelchair users, but for a whole range of disabilities. People have got more of awareness, people with mobility problems or hearing and so on. So I think that's really improved over the last 10 years. And then things like processes to make it more a lot easier. People have used the internet and websites, so that using that has made a lot of services more accessible. For example, in terms of getting hold of tickets, ticketing policies and so on have changed in that period. And then the third thing I mentioned was staff attitudes. I think just staff generally, when you're out shopping or on transport, as Stephen said, people's attitude is more positive and they're aware of being sensitive to people's access needs. So I think those are the kind of three main areas that have definitely improved over the last 10 years.
So it's quite interesting, actually, because over those 10 years, things have changed dramatically in everyone's lives. Do you think there's areas whereabouts the Equality Act needs to improve? So you've kind of spoke about online ticketing. Do you think that's an area whereabouts the Equality Act has lagged, or do you think actually no, it's kept up with the times? I'll go back to Stephen and Morgan.
Yeah, well, I think in a way some of it is to do with the enabling aspects of the Equality Act. So when things are mandated and legally required, that's one thing. But then, for example, you can understand it's important where people make reasonable adjustments, then that gives a lot of scope for things to either happen or not happen, depending on the organisation involved. So an example would be, you'll know that Morgan and I have been campaigning on changing place toilets. Now, at the moment in legislation, it's not a requirement. I know there's quite a discussion in Parliament, which has been delayed by COVID and Brexit and so on for quite a while now, to make the provision of changing place toilets, basically legally mandatable, rather than just something that's, that will be useful or helpful. So I think I'm not sure how you would really strengthen the Equality Act itself to do that. Some of it's in building regulations and so on, as that a particular example. So that's one thing. I suppose the other is the capacity for, say, local authorities or other organisations to monitor and check whether people are providing things in a more proactive way. So the kind of regulation around it, as regulation has developed over the last 10 years, is quite light touch. So if you want to not do something, quite often it's quite easy not to do something because the capacity of anybody to check on that and so on is fairly limited, I think. So those are maybe a couple of areas.
How about you, Stephen Miller? How would you have liked to see the Equality Act improve?
Yeah, I agree with them, what Stephen Morgan is saying, around making sure that people are enforcing the law and that they are doing what they're meant to be doing. That's really important. And I think, thinking back to when I was younger, I think probably it needs a bit more push behind it, like a bit more positive discrimination for the people that really need it. When I was younger, there was kind of an attitude of like, if I went out on my own, like, what are you doing out here? You shouldn't be out on your own. This people don't come out of the house. There was that kind of attitude. And we are getting better, and people are becoming more empathetic and understanding about disability and a bit less scared about disability, and that's helping, but there's still a lot more work to be done for disabled people to be truly and equally accepted in society. And I think we just need to empower disabled people more, to give them more aspiration to get jobs, to be more involved in society. And that's one area where I think the Equality Act could really help.
Well, hopefully by having this conversation, we can drive that conversation to move forward. But I'm going to move now to an area which I know we all love, and that is sport. I mean, what has the Equality Act done for, and go back to you, Stephen Miller, enjoying watching sport at Newcastle United? I know the word enjoyment and Newcastle United isn't something that are mutual beneficial, but for yourself, how has it improved your enjoyment going to watch a game?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a massive impact. I mean, I remember when I first started going to the match, you had to get to the ground 3 hours before kickoff to make sure you could get in, because there was only about 20 places. So you had to get there really early and wait outside the gate to make sure you could get into the ground. And you couldn't buy a season ticket. So yeah, the improvement's been massive over the years. And now that, yeah, you have to have a certain percentage of tickets for disabled supporters makes a massive difference. And the fact that disabled supporters can sit anywhere in the stadium and pick their seats. And like Stephen Morgan said, the staff are much more aware and much more trained to help you. All the services in the stadium are more adapted to disability. And yeah, there's just a lot more support for disability. And we, as a DSA, we get a lot of support from the club. We work really well with the club, and they recognize how important it is to cater for the disabled supporters, because at the end of the day, we're paying customers like everybody else.
I mean, for you, Morgan, watching JJ Okocha 10 years ago must have been some of the best times of your life. I know for me as a neutral, watching Bolton at that time was phenomenal, watching this club out of Greater Manchester, putting it to the bigger clubs in Manchester. I mean, so for you both, how has the Equality Act improved your enjoyment of going to, is it still the Reebok? I don't know the sponsorship names.
It's called the University of Bolton Stadium now.
Perfect, that place.
They shortened to the Unibowl.
So yeah, so for both of you, how is it? How has your enjoyment been improved by the Equality Act?
I think it's interesting. As Stephen was talking now, I was just thinking again over the 10 years. I mean, at the beginning of that period, 2014, you'll remember that Morgan and I went to see the World Cup in Brazil, and one of the things that I think improving access to live sport does is it's not just that you get access to live sport, and seeing, a JJ Okocha, world-class players, so you've got the right to see the best players. It also allows you to be part of that kind of wider community, the kind of football fan community. So that experience is, in terms of just life experience, is great. And I think that kind of travel. Now, I know we're in a COVID world where travel abroad and so on is getting more and more kind of constrained. But just to have the chance to kind of travel abroad and make that even contemplatable, I think, wouldn't have been as easy. It could be done, but it wouldn't be been as easy before the Equality Act, because airlines have got to think about it, railway, ferries, whatever it might be, and that's done on an international basis. So the Equality Act, is sort of part of the Human Rights Act and European legislation, and kind of as much as UK. So I think it's been seeing live sport, being able to see, like everybody else, the greatest players and sportsmen, be part of a wider community to enjoy, your club or your kind of favourite sport. But then there's also the travel. It's great to be able to travel and explore, in terms of just general life. So that, I think that would be my kind of feeling about what it's contributed to over the last 10 years. I mean, the other thing, just to while it's in my mind, is obviously the legislation is quite important, but economic circumstances in the last 10 years since the crash have been, in a way, a kind of a balancing against that. So it's become more difficult for people with disabilities, you know, economically and financially and so on. So the Equality Act, I guess, has been a bit of a defence against the worst difficulties of kind of a 10 years of, you know, austerity and difficulty as well. So maybe that's a part of the story over the last 10 years.
I think this might be a difficult question, and this is the last question, because in 2020 it's kind of hard to see next week rather than next year. But in the next 10 years, like, what would you like to see the Equality Act go on to achieve? What else do you think moving forward it can do? Because I think it's quite interesting you talking about how the politics of the day, it has been kind of the people with disability have kind of been protected because of this Equality Act. Do you think that's something that, with the unknown moving forward, it can continue to do?
I think it can. I think maybe it's, you know, as Stephen mentioned, we both mentioned, I think, is the capacity to be able to really check on whether the Equality Act is being fully experienced by people with disabilities. So that, I mean, again, my feeling over the last 10 years is, with the growth of social media and so on, the Equality Act gives the opportunity for groups to campaign quite effectively to make change. So I would anticipate that would keep happening over the next 10 years. But I think I would, maybe if I was wanting things to happen, I'd like the kind of local authority and public service system to be more proactive, so that people didn't have to campaign so hard to get things to the right level. So that would be what I'd hope would happen over the next 10 years.
Stephen, coming to you for the last one, mate.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the point I made before about empowering disabled people, and I think that needs to happen a lot more, and hopefully in the next 10 years the Equality Act can help to push the agenda of getting more disabled people in positions where they can directly influence what's happening in society, that can influence the decision making at the top level. And I think there is a bit of an inequality within the equality arena, and we're seeing a lot of work done along the lines of race equality and gender equality, but we need a lot more work on disability equality and getting more disabled people into those influential positions where they can make a real difference. So that's what I would like to see over the next 10 years.
Perfect. I thank you to Morgan, Stephen, and Stephen for giving up the time. I don't know when this will go out. I'm sure at that point in time, Newcastle will be top of the league, Bolton will be top of the league, and Forest will be nearly relegated. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'll talk to you all soon.